Hello and welcome to another Focus on the Author Spotlight from the book, The Other Side of Divorce. And I want to introduce you to my very dear friend, Dinalynn Rosenbush. She is an international best-selling author. She's a speech language pathologist. She's an educator. She's a speaker. She's a parent coach and mentor. And I think if you talk to Dinalynn for any more than a minute, you're going to know that her biggest passion are caring for her kids and her grandkids. So Dinalynn's been working in this area for 25 years, helping children and parents cope with difficulties and challenges, particularly around communication. So Dinalynn, I am so excited to have you here, and I am so excited to listen to more about what you do.
Thank you, Marty, for having me. This has been so fun. It's fun to be part of your book. It's such an honor. And the work you're doing in the world really makes a difference. And I remember when I got divorced, to have this kind of information to encourage you beyond where you are right now is so empowering.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing this.
Thank you for being a part of it. And I'm going to pop off the screen and let you take over.
Yes, my name is Dinalynn, and I have been a speech language pathologist for a long time. And what happened was when I was working in that field, parents would say to me, "You work your magic. How do you work that magic?" As if it was magic. And I started thinking at first, like, what are they talking about? And I started thinking of it kind of like when an electrician comes to your house or something, and they fix something and voila, your lights go on all correctly with just the flick of a switch. And that to me seems like magic. Or my cell phone is working, and that's magic because I don't understand that. And then tech, people work tech, and that's got to be magic because when I tie cords together in knots, they don't work, but other people are able to make things really work. But of course, this is really a process. It is that people know how to do certain things. And when I don't know how to do certain things, it feels like magic. So I started thinking parents are just simply not knowing the steps, the process that we use as speech pathologists to get their kiddos to be able to communicate. So I thought, I wonder if I can bring parents into my classroom and teach them directly how they can teach their kids, but to do it in small nuggets at a time. So I did. I started inviting parents into my classroom, and then I had, parents of all different backgrounds come in with me. And it was interesting to me that some of the parents that did the best were the ones that had absolutely no background in child development. They had no understanding of how speech and language is developed. And one such person, for example, was a man who was a construction worker who came in, and he did not have any background. He was asking me about feeding. He was asking me about getting the kids to sleep well, how to eat better, how to correct behaviors, all of the things. And so what we did, and this little girl came in with only vowel sounds because, I specialize in speech and language therapy. So this little girl only had vowel sounds. She's a 3-year-old, and I started teaching dad. Now, he was able to come in for 20 minutes a week, and he picked up this little girl out of the bed in daycare. And she slept on his chest about half the time because she was unwilling to wake up. She was unable to wake up. She was deeply sleeping and crabby. So I started role-playing with him, and he just copycatted with me. Sometimes he was her, and sometimes he was going to be me then. And then I would send him home with just a little bit of information, and I'd say, do this. And a week later, she would have that down. And so I give him another piece of information, do this. And he did. And I actually got to interview him in my podcast, The Language of Play, on episode 154. And he, so you can hear him if you want to hear the rest of that story. But the point being is that without any background, he just did what he was told. And this little girl had caught up to age level in 13 months, which is phenomenal. And really, though I guided the process and certainly did the process, he was the one that carried it out because 20 minutes a week, it makes a difference, but it doesn't make as much difference as the parent that's going to be doing it every day and is able to drop it into mealtime, to drop it into bath time, to drop it into the normal flow of life. And so she got multiple interactions that were 30 seconds or whatever length of time per teaching moment. Anyway, fast forward, I thought I'm going to do this with a lot of parents. Now I am running a coaching program to help parents of kids that have speech and language delays. And of course, some parents don't, and they still come to, and I certainly help them with things related to behavior or other communication struggles. But another thing that parents don't realize is that communication delays can look like your child isn't listening, or they're not quite comprehending what they heard. It can look like your child has sound or words, but they're really not expanding those words into sentences. Or maybe they're using clippy kind of phrases or echoing the thing you say, but it's not making a meaningful conversation between the two of you. All of those things and more could be a speech and language delay. So anyway, I do my podcast. We focus on teaching a lot of things about speech and language delays, and I'm helping kiddos. Now, how it is that I got to know you is because I too was divorced. And when I wanted to help my kiddos, I found that I leaned into my education as a speech language pathologist, because when you learn how the brain learns, you end up diving right into where the children tick. And where they tick is that emotional center of their brain. They tick in that their thinking process is not the same way we think. When we look at their behavior and they act in a way that just doesn't make sense, it's not because they're thinking the way we think. It's not because they're like what parents commonly do is say, man, if I acted like that, I would feel like this. So they must really be feeling like this. For example, I'd be really mad. So I wonder why they're really mad. That could totally not even be the case. So kids don't think the way we do. They think pretty exclusively in that emotional center of their brain. And so when we learn how to operate in that and communicate with our kids in that brain center, then we connect to the heart of them and we capture their attention differently. Now, what is that? How do we do that? What I like to say to parents is, I like to say, think about play. And the first thing people think about is coloring and Legos and role playing, the typical kid toys. And though that is true, I'm not denying that, that is true. I want us to anchor in a different way to think about play. And when we think about it differently, I want parents to think about words such as exploration, discovery, creativity, wonder. When we think about those words, we can feel our whole body just kind of relax, and we can feel ourselves expand into like, wow, what happens then? Children operate like that all the time. That's where their brain is, because every single moment of every day is like a new experience for them. And they don't always connect what they just did 10 minutes ago with what they're doing now. And we can teach something to our kids over and over, and then when we do it in a different environment, it's not relevant anymore. They're learning it brand new because they haven't yet, we call the word generalized. And that means to take it from one environment into the next environment and realize that these are the same tasks or rules. But kids don't do that. They're constantly in this state of play. So how can we use language that gets into that frame of mind with our kids? And when we learn to, we are using a language that I call a language of play to be able to connect and communicate with our kiddos. And that is the foundation of the podcast. That is also the foundation of my coaching program that teaches parents to be able to connect to the heart of your kids, be able to help them build their communication skills in listening, in comprehension, in language expression, in speech development, and to be able to connect really to that heart and build courage and strength in them. So that is what my podcast and my coaching business is about, and a little history behind me. Thank you, Marty.
Well, thank you, Dinalynn. That was so interesting. And I love your message because I'm going to bring it back to the divorce. It is a lot of kids, and you and I both have a little bit of similar background. I was an educator for many years, and then I was a behavior consultant in school districts. And I think, one of the things that often happens when kids are going through a divorce is their behavior regresses a little bit, especially the younger children. And sometimes kids may start having behavioral problems that don't necessarily come out at the home, but may come out at school. And parents are like, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand. And so I love this idea of creating a sense of play where parents can build that communication with their children, because divorce is tough for kids.
It really is. It really is. And when we can get ourselves in the mindset, it also helps us to navigate the divorce too. Because when you think about it, we are suddenly thrown into, I'm discovering, I'm exploring, I am creating, I have no idea where to go. So there's all those negative emotions with it, but we are still in that, like, you wonder what's going on next.
Yeah. And I do want to throw out here something that I always put in every one of these podcasts that we talk, when we talk about parenting. Divorce is going to be hard on your children. I think, anybody is going to accept that that's a reality, but I'm going to throw this big but out there. Staying in a toxic family relationship where parents are in conflict, or where there's, that constant tension in the home, passive aggressive kind of behaviors that sometimes people in conflict use, that is actually more damaging to children than being in two homes with happy, healthy parents who are able to be effective in their parenting roles. So, like I said, I just love what you do. And I love the fact that you are able to support, families going through divorce, or families that are staying intact and are struggling with communication issues with kids.
Right. Right. Whether or not you're in a divorce. I mean, clearly, when you are getting a divorce or have been divorced, there's going to be even more of the emotional part that is connected.
Right.
But I can't really say that, even though I've just said that, because that's the operating system that our kids are in. So
Right.
It's just that we tend to see more of the negative, fearful type of emotions versus more happy emotions. It's not that there's more emotions. It's more of the difficult emotions.
Exactly.
Because the operating center of the brain is that emotional center.
Right.
And
Right.
if we can work in that, then we can help our kids to release some of that fear, to find where they can trust, where they can anchor in to trust again.
Right.
Because of course, a divorce shatters some of that trust. And so we are really in a state of helping our children realize that they can trust you. You're not going to leave them. The spouse didn't actually leave them. And that takes some time, but it can be done. And when your kids eventually realize that, oh, I'm not abandoned, even though they separated, I'm not let go, then kids it certainly builds resilience. They can certainly come through it.
Yes.
Come through it well.
And I want to ask you, this is a little bit off the behavioral track, but I know this is kind of your wheelhouse area of expertise. What are some of the signs that parents should look for or should be aware of that may indicate that their child has some kind of language challenge, like very early? Because I know, I'm going to just throw this out here. My niece, who I won't name because she'd be mortified, when she was a little one, she had quite a significant lisp, to the point where she really couldn't say S's, and a few other letters were really tough for her. And my sister noticed it very early, but what are some of the signs, other than, say, something obvious like a lisp or something? When as a parent should you start thinking, I need to speak to a speech and language pathologist, or I need to reach out and get some help for my child?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. And all of a sudden, several answers riveted through my head. So I'm going to try to be succinct. First, I want to say that a lisp, like you're talking about, as soon as it becomes evident, if you talk about it with your kids early on, it is one of the easiest things to correct. But this is a common mistake that parents make, is just waiting for it to self-correct. And that, I say no. And if you have a child that is very young and they have a speech sound wrong, in the state of Minnesota where I am, they probably will not get service until they hit 9 years old, because that's when their scores will be far enough from the norm that they're considered disabled by one sound mistake. So I say immediately, you can, if you go to a speech pathologist there, and I worked in that place, they will say, well, they don't qualify to receive speech and language services because their scores are in the normal range. That doesn't mean that you can't correct it. So I'm kind of answering this question a little bit muddy for you, because I don't want parents to necessarily wait until they're bad enough to ask.
Right.
So if there is a question, you can ask somebody like me, and you can certainly go to a speech language pathologist in your school district, or, like at the clinic, and ask somebody. That's always in bounds to ask. But if you get the comment that, oh, that's normal, that doesn't mean to leave it. It's typical. Yeah, that doesn't mean, like, I can't think of a good example at the moment off the top of my head, but, just because something is common, like somebody doesn't bring out the trash this is a bad example, but it's what I thought of. Somebody doesn't bring out the trash every day in their house, and their house smells sometimes. That's common. It happens, but that doesn't mean you just keep on doing it.
Right. Actually, I think that's a great example.
Is it? Well, I don't know why I thought of that. Maybe because I just hauled out the trash before I came down the stairs here. But anyways, So so getting back to what it is that you were saying, if a parent has any kind of question about, boy, my child just doesn't really seem to understand what I'm saying to them, if you have a wonder, do ask. And if you don't have a wonder, it's still time to learn, because the other common mistake that I see parents make is this, not just noticing that there's an error and waiting for it to develop, but to not even consider that these mistakes that children make are correctable.
Right.
And I advocate for, when you notice that a word isn't used correctly, when you notice that your child used a very short sentence with maybe the wrong verb tense, or that they could add a little bit more to their speech, continuously pour into them a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And that's what I think that if we did that regularly, they will pick it up and come along faster. But I often see parents fearful, thinking it is magic. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, they think it's kind of magic. I'm afraid I'm going to ruin my child or hurt their self-esteem if I correct their speech or their language. But I'd rather you think of that as like, how does the child hold a fork when they're eating? If they're holding it, some weird way, you just turn their hand around and say, do it this way.
Right.
Or a pan.
Yeah.
And we just tell them. If they're tying their shoes and their shoelaces don't stay tied, we just show them, and we show them again. Keep it as normal as that, so that it is normal to correct along the way. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, there are plenty of charts, excuse me, there are charts online to help you know for speech sounds. If you can't understand your child, there are lots of different charts online. There's they'll tell you how long is a typical sentence, what kinds of things does your child talk about. But if you're looking for hallmark problems, I will say, if your child echoes you instead of answers you, that's a red flag.
Okay.
If you don't understand your child, that's a red flag. If your child has multiple sound errors, that might be a red flag. If your child has, and of course, every one of these things is kind of titrated along age, isn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
But if your child is trying to tell you a story about what happened today, and you are asking 20 questions, and maybe your child is 8 years old, and you are probably 6 years old, and you're asking 20 questions to try to get deeper.
Right.
What happened? Who? Where? When? And you are blurry about what it is that they're really meaning. These are red flags.
Yeah. And I think that, the reality is that when children if they have a speech and language problem, an auditory problem, they have a processing problem where they're not able to process the language, there's one thing with dealing with it in the home, but kids that have language problems, we know statistically are bullied more at school. They have a harder time with academics. They have poor relationships with their teachers. And that all contributes to how that child is going to experience life. Because if they have, we know that when kids struggle in school, that's a predictor of, future challenges. And so really working with your children very early and very lovingly and getting the professional support is really the best way to set your children up with a strong foundation for early school all the way through to college, university, grad school, whatever they choose to do, right? So that speech and language thing is so critical, because the older the child is, the less they how shall I put this, the harder it is to change something, right? The longer it's been a habit, or the longer it's gone untreated, the harder it is to correct it and to get the child back on track.
Absolutely. And that's why I always anchor into the idea of get help sooner than you think your child might need help. Because even if I had a parent come to me with a very typical developing kid, I can say, do these things, and you're going to move your kid along faster. Because when you work with the brain, way the brain was designed to work, it's like giving fertilizer to the growth. And you mentioned language and how language impacts academics and social life. Vocabulary is the number one indicator of academic success. So if your child is not picking up on vocabulary, it's like we're not setting them up for success academically.
Right.
And then let's say you're going to add a divorce onto the top of low vocabulary or some normal struggles. That's a big, big struggle then, because they can't express their emotions. They can't understand what's going on, and they can't talk about what's going on with their peers. And we know that, just as a general rule of thumb, if you look at the CDC or the NIH, they'll say that approximately 10% of kids are in that disabled area between the ages of 3 and 10. That's a huge proportion.
Right.
And that's the ones that actually qualify to get help. That means that's the bottom 4% of kids in that developmental area. But what about those kids that are between 5 and 20%? They're still struggling a lot.
Right.
And I don't know about your state, but here, there really isn't anything for them. It's up to the parent to close the gap. And that's why I'm here.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to bring this to, and we're almost out of time, but I did want to highlight that there are options outside of what the school, because the school is mandated by the state and there's specific criteria to treat kids. And, if you're 1/10 of 1% off the line, that's it. You don't qualify. Whereas you could go to Dinalynn, who offers this privately, and you don't have those kind of qualification requirements, do you?
Exactly. It is a disability service in the school, period. And if you don't qualify, which means getting a score low enough to put you in a disability category.
Right.
If you don't score low enough, you don't get the service. And because you're not disabled. It falls under the umbrella of special education and disability service. But that doesn't mean that the kiddos are not struggling that are not disabled. They are struggling, yes. And I can tell you, there are areas in my life that I struggle in, and I go get help. Mechanics in my car. I already mentioned a few other things, that people that I think are magic because I don't know how.
Yeah.
But you get help in those areas. Like when I was going through a divorce, if I had known about you, Mardi, I would have said, Mardi, help me. And, it's invaluable to find somebody, and especially while your kids are young, because their rapid brain expansion at that point in their life is so worth anchoring into communication, because communication leans back into their relationship. It anchors their emotions. They become settled. From that space, you can teach just about anything.
Yeah.
You can do just about anything. And the trust is built, and you have just the meat of the foundation there to build. And early.
Yeah. Sorry, Dinalynn, to cut you off there.
We're both excited about this topic.
Yeah, I know. You don't get my call. It just goes and goes. So, it's so funny when you say this, because I was thinking there are 4 words that I know I don't say right. So I am super or I know if I have to say them, I have to slow down and I have to think about the word before I can say it. And you know what? It is amazing because I know those 4 words are kind of my, I don't know if you call them triggers or whatever for not knowing that I'm going to say them wrong. They come up all the time in conversation because I'm so sensitive about them. Like vulnerable is one of them. I hate that word. I wish they'd have never invented it. I just can't say it. So definitely, like I say, our language and the way we communicate is how people respond to us. As adults, when you go into an interview, that interviewer, I forget what the statistic, that's another one I can't say, statistic. I forget what the statistic is, but it's something like in the first 9 seconds of communication, people have already decided if they like you or don't like you. And I read that book, Blink. I don't know if you've ever read that book about how.
You told me about that book, and I want to read it sometime.
It is like how snap we make decisions about everything, not just about people, but about everything. And so having that effective communication really does have an impact on lifelong ability to do what you want to do and pursue your goals and do all those wonderful things. Dinalynn, you have provided a wealth of information for us today, and your chapter in the book is phenomenal. I am so excited for people to be able to get out and read it and help, because it's really all about getting through the divorce and then starting to make these changes. And you talk about, the great ways that you worked with your kids. And I know we've talked about how you supported your kids throughout the divorce. So that has been absolutely phenomenal. And like I say, thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to encourage everybody to get the book. Make sure you read it, but also make sure that you reach out to Dinalynn. Can you just give us your website real quick, Dinalynn, and I'll make sure all your other contact information is in the show notes here.
Thank you for asking that. Yes, thelanguageofplay.com. However, I haven't published it yet, so the website is not up and running. But I am at hello@thelanguageofplay.com, and there's a link tree that we'll put into that show notes. And that way, when my website is actually up and running, it will be there too. So I will put a link tree in. And anybody, anytime, hello@thelanguageofplay.com, or go to my podcast, The Language of Play, and the show notes has my email also.
Yeah. And I want to put in a plug for the Language of Play podcast. It is phenomenal. I listen to it, and it is a 1.5% top global podcast. So that is an extraordinary accomplishment. So definitely check out that podcast. And Dinalynn, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, it does point to that you're not alone when you wonder these things. Lots of people are wondering these things about children and development.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Dinalynn, and thank you for listening in. And don't forget to tune in to our next Spotlight on the Author.